Already? Spicy. Drop the spice on this camera. What's going on? Welcome to a detailed run through on creating a VM on Azure. If you're just getting started on Azure, this video is a whistle-stop tour on how to provision a VM. So we're going to create a new virtual server running Server 2022. We're going to attach a 128GB SSD disk, and whilst not recommended for the long term, we'll be enabling public RDP for testing. So we're going to walk you through step by step and explain what every setting does. And by the end of this, hopefully, you'll be a wizard. Wizard. Let's take it away. Without further ado, we want to provision a virtual machine, so you need to log into your Azure account. We're logged into the starkindustry.co.uk account here, which is our lab, and we've built a sort of pretty basic. We've got a subscription for our sandbox where we're going to be doing our sort of like demo environment, and then really quickly, it's not really relevant for building a virtual machine, but we'll show you the management group config that we've got. So we've got a Stark Industry, platform, connectivity, and then the landing zone where we've got our sandbox, and that sandbox has a subscription. Now, if you're just getting started, you'll probably just have a pay-as-you-go subscription, and that's fine. You can just leave it exactly as it is. Just use your free $200 credit on Azure. That's fine. When you sign in, it'll look something like this. First thing to go and do is go and make your virtual machine. Now, we'll walk you through the wizard in terms of everything that you need to set and what everything does and how that all fits together. First thing, click on Create. I'm going to create an Azure virtual machine. First thing we need to create is a resource group. It's a collection of objects that all fit together. So whether that's servers for a particular application, servers for a particular project together, and we normally group them, well, we like to group them by region. We're going to make a new resource group, and we're going to call this rg-vm project-prod-uk south-001. We've now made our resource group, so that's going to contain anything to do with our project. Now we've got our virtual machine name. We're going to call this VM Project 1, just for the purpose of testing it. Now we get to choose our region. There's loads of different regions in Azure. So we probably use sort of UK South, UK West, and EU West. Within a region, you have availability zones, and different regions have different amounts of availability zones. An availability zone is effectively a data center that's on normally the same campus, but they're connected at low latency. And you can use them to make sure that you've got an element of high availability within your solution. So we're going to go ahead and choose UK South for Europe, because that's what we normally do. Typically, when you're choosing your region, you want to choose somewhere that is close to your customers or close to your users that'll be using the system. Then we get a range of availability options where we can choose how available we want that machine to be. First option is no infrastructure redundancy required. Now, if you're building a single VM application, you're going to be using the option for no infrastructure redundancy. This is normally used where you're building multiple machines for an application, like you're building 2 web servers, 2 application servers that are going to power your application. And you want them to be in separate availability zones, so separate data centers, or you want them to be in separate racks inside the data center. So for this VM, we're probably going to choose no infrastructure redundancy required, but if you were building an application that you had to have it in different availability zones, you can choose availability zone. And with that, you can choose which zone you want it to be in. You might decide, actually, my web server 1, I'm going to put that in zone 1, web server 2, I'm going to put that in zone 2. And that means that if zone 1 has a problem, your web server still functions. That's availability zones. Then you've got virtual machine scale set, which again is very similar actually to scale machines up across multiple zones. You know, if you have an application that will scale to say 5, 10, 15 machines, you can put them in a scale set. And that scale set will actually coordinate where those machines are actually located to make sure the application is always available. So then we've got an availability set which distributes your VMs across multiple racks, which basically means that if you have a single rack failure in the data center, that your workload won't be impacted. For the purpose of this demo, we're just going to choose no infrastructure redundancy required because it's just a single VM. Security type. So far, I haven't come across a requirement that needs anything other than standard. Trusted launch virtual machines are going to give you a TPM, so that might allow you to do things like encryption. But as I say, we've not come after anything that requires that yet. Once chosen the security type, which will be standard for this one, we can configure the image. Now, Azure comes with a whole range of images that you can choose from. So you can see here, there's 4,761 images available to choose from. Now, we're only bothered about, for the purpose of this demo, Windows Server 2022, but you can choose loads of stuff. For Ubuntu, CentOS, Rocky Linux. There's a bunch of appliances from the marketplace that you can also deploy. So that's great. Due 2022 Azure Edition. Now, the reason I've not chosen Core is because, of course, if we choose Core, we'll have no user interface. It's easy for the purpose of this demo to choose something where we have a UI. As we come back to VM architecture, two types of processors in Azure. You've got ARM 64-bit and x64. Now, most deployments you're going to do in a normal environment are probably going to be x64. ARM, there's limited support for, as my understanding at the moment. We haven't come across anything yet where we've chosen to use that. The spot discount is quite cool. Basically, you get a discount for using the capacity. However, you have to be prepared for the fact that Azure can just turn that workload off at a moment's notice. But that's quite good for spinning up lots of different workload at the same time, and it doesn't matter if it's destroyed, you can get a significant discount for doing that. But the sort of detail that is slightly outside of the remit of this. Now we get to choose the size of our virtual machine. We can pick all sorts of different options around sort of capability, performance, different types of disks that can be attached. And it's whether every single generation of machine has a different limit of what it can do. Most machines that you're going to build in a typical enterprise environment where you're building like thick IaaS VMs are going to be probably like D series or perhaps F series, depending what the configuration is. But to help you figure out what you need, you can just simply use these drop downs and it will help narrow down the search. So we can go with 2 CPUs, let's go with 4 gig of RAM. We can choose other things here, like whether they support premium disk. So we might say, actually, we want to have premium disk support. In fact, let's just go by RAM, it's easier. So let's say 8 gig of RAM and show me anything that's got 8 gig of RAM. Here we can see the D series VMs. We've got D2 DSV5, that's got 2 CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, 4 disks, max ARPS is 3,750, and that's $162 a month. So for the purpose of the demo, we'll choose that, hit select, and now we can see it's loading the price, it's $162 a month. Going to set a username for the admin account, so we're going to set this to Mr. Admin. I'm going to set the password to something simple. Okay, once the password's set and the username is set, we can set whether we want to allow public access. Now, again, for the purpose of this demo, we want to make sure that public inbound is permitted because we want to be able to show that it's working. But normally, you don't want RDP open to the world. It is a massive no. Reason for that is that most VMs, when they have RDP open, people will attempt to compromise them by guessing the password or brute forcing it or exploiting some form of vulnerability. So you definitely want to make sure that RDP isn't turned on public workload. But for the purpose of this, that's fine. Next option is licensing. If you have a valid license for Windows on-prem, and there's lots of nuance to this about whether you can use it or not. You have to have a certain amount of cores on-prem, you have to have valid software assurances, loads of specific things that you require to have to use this. But if you have it, you can save quite a lot of money. Now, we don't have the rights to use that to save money, so we're just going to skip on by. But if you do have licenses, you can tick that and it will give you a significant saving, not on the compute, but on the Windows licensing, which can make up a chunk of the cost. Next, don't want to say the password. Next option, choose your disks. Different types of storage. Now, here we've got premium SSD selected because that's what we've chosen for the machine type. Where we're choosing premium SSD, that'll give us the highest volume, the highest amount of performance, also got the highest price point. We're going to choose premium SSD for this deployment, and that's the OS disk type. So that's what the actual machine itself uses, and it's worth pointing out here that that is LRS. So it is locally redundant only. So it's within a single data center. Azure VMs as standard are not protected across multiple data centers. That's really important to point out. It is on you as the customer to make sure that your VM is protected. So don't get caught out by that because it's very easy to do so. But we'll do another video on how to walk through setting up Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup, because again, there's lots of things that we wish we knew, many years ago that would help save some people some time. We're going to go with premium SSD for that. You can choose to keep the disk when you delete the virtual machine. This can be a bit of a savior. If someone accidentally deletes a VM, you still got the disk, you just reattach it and off you go. But we're going to leave it on delete with VM for the purpose of this. Key management, we haven't really used anything other than platform managed key. But maybe we'll pick up doing a video about that if we come across a use case for it. Next thing we're going to go and do is we're going to attach a new disk because we need a 128 gig SSD for this machine to use. Now, it's worth pointing out that on the machine specs, a lot of these machines will come with a temporary disk, but that temporary disk is deleted every time you reboot it, and none of that data is protected. If you need a disk for some form of project or installation, you need to make sure you actually go and attach it. So I'm going to create a new disk. We'll leave the name blank as it is currently, and we're going to say it's an empty disk. We're going to choose the size, so we're going to change size, and these are all the premium disks that we can basically pick from. But we can also choose standard SSD or standard HDD. We'll go with premium SSD again, 128 gig. And we can see here that's going to give us 500 IOPS provisioned with a maximum burst of 3,500 IOPS, which is plenty. Click on OK, and we can tick the box for delete the disk with the VM. Again, it's just making sure if we delete the VM that the disk is actually going. We can save that. Next, so you see that the disk has been attached, and we get some options for things like host caching. This is used on different applications. Some items, such as Active Directory, require that you actually go ahead and change this, which very few people seem to know. It's always worth reading the Azure docs when you're building something and see if there's a recommendation around host caching. The only thing I've come across so far is Active Directory VMs where you're building full fat AD. So we'll check through the advanced menu. Manage disks. I've not really seen any use case where that's not been used, so I'm going to skip past that. But ephemeral OS disks. This is quite useful for Azure Virtual Desktop, but not really in the purpose of the scope for building a single virtual machine. But you can make the disk basically get blown away back to a snapshot when the machine is powered down or deallocated. That's great for things like Azure Virtual Desktop because you know it's going back to the image. Next thing we're going to go to is networking. We need to build a virtual network. So we're going to need to allocate an address space. The default is 10.0.0.0/16, so that's a massive address block, but we can leave that as default. Within that, we've allocated the first /24, which is 10.0.0.0/24. Now, naming conventions, everyone gets up in arms over this, but if we go to the Azure abbreviations page, and we go find in the Cloud Adoption Framework, which is super useful, there's a set of abbreviations for resource types. Let's go find the VNet if we search for it. VNet, so virtual network, wherever you're using it, you always use VNet. So we will go VNet-sandbox, because it's in our sandbox subscription, -prod-UK south-001. That would be our network name for this. And then we can set the subnet name. So subnet, it'll be snet-sandbox-prod, because SNet is actually the abbreviation for subnet. I highly recommend use this to standardize your Azure naming convention because it makes life 10 times easier. Because we know as techies, we like to argue around naming convention, and we've spent many an hour deliberating what to call things and then deleting them because you can't rename them. We're going to use SNet. So we'll go back to here, SNet sandbox prod-UK south-001. Of course, some resources are not region specific, but a lot are. Again, think about your naming convention wisely and use the right suffixes on your name. But if you have a naming convention, what's really cool is you only have a limited thing to actually type. You know, if you're always using the prefix and then you've got a name for something and then you've got a suffix, that's only really giving you the option to set what is here, which makes life really easy once you get going and means that if you do it clean from the start, it's a lot easier to manage. So we can go ahead and click OK. And that's going to build our network. Now, public IP. Again, this VM, we're going to give it a public IP because we want to be able to get to it remotely and we don't have to go and set up a load of sites or VPNs just to do this demo for you. So we're going to create a new public IP allocation. We're going to call this pip dash, because pip is the prefix, VM project 1 dash prod dash UK south dash 001. You can have different tiers of public IP addresses. Oddly, basic and standard. Why not just like standard and premium? But effectively, basic, if I remember rightly, is a single availability zone. I'm pretty sure it is. I think basic is a... Let's go quickly check. Yeah, so here we can see, so basic availability zones are not supported, whereas on standard they are supported. And you can also have zone redundant IPs where there's 3 AZs live. Effectively, most of the time you're probably using standard IPs. So yeah, we'll go ahead and choose standard on that. It'll be static, and then you can choose how it routes over the Microsoft network or over the internet. 9 times out of 10, you'll be choosing Microsoft network. We will do a video when we talk about Azure Firewall, and into that, we'll get into some of the routing preferences and NAT gateways. Okay, that. Cool, so now we can see the IPs there, we've got our VNet, we've got our SNet, and now we're going to choose a security group. For the purpose of this, we'll choose basic. We could choose none, but there'd literally be no security whatsoever and no way to customize it without making up the rules, so we'll go with basic. Public inbound ports, as the name says, this is the stuff you're going to allow remotely. Now, in this drop down here, you can choose the standard inbound ports for public services. Now, we're going to be going with RDP only, but again, just to be clear, do not allow stuff on the public internet unless you know the particular machine is secure. Ideally, you want some sort of other controls like multi-factor authentication or certificates to protect your workload. Now, just like you can with the disks, you can also delete the public IP when the NIC is deleted. Again, you can turn that on. Accelerated networking is going to give you a boost on certain machine types, so you can have more throughput, greater performance. It's not available on every single machine type, so if you need a high-level network performance or low latency, just watch out for that. And next we go to management. Defender for Cloud. This is a really cool product, and I definitely recommend that you turn this on your servers. We will definitely do a video on this in more detail, but it will give you a bunch of recommendations and install things like Defender for Cloud on the VM if it's a supported OS, and it will report all of that for you inside the Azure portal, so definitely recommend having that. Identity. This is cool if you need to use a machine account, I believe, to access certain services without having to store credentials in the actual code. And you can use things like Key Vault. Again, not really seen a use case for this on a virtual machine, but we have used Key Vault with Azure apps that we've deployed. Azure AD, again, if you want to log in with Azure AD, you can tick this box and that will allow you to sign into the machine with your Active Directory. Auto shutdown. So shutdown combined with deallocate will enable you to save some money. Yes, okay, you can use this to shut them down, but this is not going to deallocate the machine. And if you want to save some money, you need to make sure that you deallocate the VM. We are not going to bother with that at the moment because we don't need it. Disaster recovery, if you want to do the config for Azure Site Recovery, you can do it from here, but I wouldn't bother because I think it will use a bunch of defaults that will mess up your naming convention. So we'll go and do it afterwards. Hot patch is only available in certain OSs. So at the moment, I think it's only available in 2022 Server Core. So hot patch is quite cool. Allows you to patch the VM without actually rebooting. That's decent. It'll save a lot of time, a lot of headaches. If you can use Server Core and you want that feature, you'll be able to turn that on in the menu here. Next up, and you've got how you're going to manage your patching. If you have an availability set, you can use Azure Orchestrator. That's going to make sure that it patches the workload in a way that won't impact your production application. You can choose manual updates for you to actually manually install them, or you can choose automatic. Automatic is good where you can interrupt a workload and it doesn't impact the production systems. But you might prefer manual and to have some more control through like an RMM or another tool or something inside Azure. Now, because this is just a demo, we're going to choose automatic. Next, we've got monitoring. So you've got a bunch of built-in alert rules that you can just simply turn on in this menu, which is really cool, super easy, makes life a lot easier as an administrator. So out of the box, when you tick that, you can see here we've got a couple of recommended alert rules that we can make. We've got percentage of CPUs greater than 80%, available memory is less than a gig. We've got things like networking total is greater than 500 gig, which could indicate a problem. And we can actually configure here straight away an email to come to us, or we can do a mobile app notification once we've signed into the app, which is pretty cool too. This is really useful as an admin just to make life nice and easy. Now, you might have a monitoring tool, but I still think it's worth doing for the cost of 60 cents a month. But we don't need that for this, so we'll turn that off. Boot diagnostics, we don't use this on our Azure Virtual Desktop images because it seems to cause problems and you have to turn it off anyway, but we can go ahead and we can enable it with a managed storage account. Now, if like us, you get particularly fussy around the naming convention of your storage accounts, because we do, you can go ahead and enable it with a custom storage account and then you can set it to be whatever you want. And again, just like everything in Azure, storage account has a prefix. So if we search in here for storage account, it's going to be ST, I think. Storage account, yeah, ST. The name is unique across the whole of Azure because it uses this core.windows.net. Whatever you put in here that begins with ST or whatever you want it to contain, it is going to need to be unique across the whole of Azure. I think if we probably try like ST boot diagnostics. Oh, that is actually available, which is incredibly surprising because I didn't think it would be. Let's try boot. It says it's available. I don't know why it's doing that. We'll cut this bit out. So for this, we're going to go with managed storage account. Now, you can tick this box here to basically increase the amount of logging that you're doing on your virtual machine about particular applications or metrics. Again, don't really see a need for that. You might have a monitoring tool that's doing that for you, make life a bit easier. So we'll go to advanced. In here, you've got a load of other options. Extensions. So these are pre-configured tools inside Azure that you can deploy to make your life easier. There's a bunch of stuff in here that's supported from day one. So you've got like Sentinel-1, Microsoft Anti-Malware, Azure Pipelines Agent, and Acronis Backup. There's a bunch of options in there that you can deploy, make life easy for yourself, but it doesn't cover absolutely everything. Next, you've got VM applications. Now, this is really cool. Now, obviously, this tenancy at the moment doesn't have any, but if you use things like Chrome on every machine, not that you should, But if you're using Chrome or like Sentinel-1 that's your own build, or you've got another antivirus application that you want to roll out, or a program you run over like an RMM, like Datto, you can actually build a custom deployment of that application and actually deliver it inside the portal. So you can, if you're building a lot of machines, you can make life a lot easier for yourself by having them as custom VM applications. Then all you need to do is go in here, click on them, and install them to your VM before it boots. Or sorry, should I say, once it's booted, it'll install them for you. Again, not seeing necessarily a use case to use this, but you can do custom data passed into the virtual machine while it's being provisioned. I suspect that's probably useful for if you've got an application that installs as part of the build. But again, I haven't really seen that used because that's normally things like containers where you're doing that like an Azure App Service where it's not going to be done on a full fat machine. NVMe, this is super fast storage, like incredibly fast. It's only available in a very limited amount of regions at the moment, but going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how that can be used to really improve machine performance. Host groups. So if you have a host group, like you've got a dedicated host for your Azure VMs, it'll appear in here. That gives you the most level of control around like where your workload is running, but also provides you with some challenges. We haven't really found a use case for that so far. Next one, capacity reservation. During the pandemic and from time to time, Azure runs out of space. So you can actually purchase a capacity reservation to make sure that you can spin up workload. For example, let's say you're in, this is pretty common, you're in UK South and you want to replicate your VM to UK West. And let's say, because UK West is a smaller region, everyone is in UK South. UK South falls over, everyone wants to spin up in UK West. Well, guess what? They've only got limited capacity. So if you don't reserve it, you won't have the availability to use it if everyone else is trying to. You can do a capacity reservation and that will allow you to make sure that you've got that capacity there to use. And I think it also gives you a slight discount, which is good. Proximity placement, this is for ultra low latency applications. So you can actually make sure that those VMs are close to one another. This is particularly useful for things like Progress DB that relies upon low latency, or certain applications that the UI needs to have super low latency because it's very chatty. So yeah, you can use that for those annoying applications. Tags, this is kind of something that you'll explore over time, but here you can tag this with like a particular department, a particular application, a particular like patching schedule, or when you're going to do something like, oh, this is the service we do maintenance on at 9 p.m. every third Wednesday. And you can use tags to control some of the automations in the background as you get more advanced with what you're doing in Azure. The next step is review and create. This is going to basically summarize and check that we've got nothing wrong in our configuration. And that'll take probably like 20 seconds max. Validation passed, hurrah. Next up, we're going to hit create. And then we pray to the Azure gods. Initializing deployment. We built a VM. All we got to do now is sit and drink our nice fresh apple cider. It's not sponsored. Cool, deployment's in progress. Now we'll sit here and continue waiting. It's very effective engineer. Cool, so deployment's complete. We have a VM, hurrah. So right, let's go to this resource. And we can see it is running. Mission has been accomplished. We have our VM running. It's a D2 DSV5, 2 CPUs, 8 gig of memory. We can see here our public IP address, which we'll blur out so you can't log on to it. Joking, because we're going to delete it immediately, because we're not losers. Next job is we're going to try and sign into this and see if it worked, which I'm sure it did. PC name, go, add, double click on that. Log in with our admin account. Doesn't have a valid certificate, which is fine. Click continue. And we should, as if by magic, we're on our machine. Let me just window that. Cool, so that machine is loaded. If we look at our file explorer, we can see we've got our machine with our C drive and D drive. And if we just go to disk management, we can see here, this is the disk that we actually attached. So it's important to mention that when you add a disk onto an Azure VM and then you power it on, it's not going to be attached. You'll need to go into disk management and actually format it ready for use. So here we can see in disk management we've got disk 2, and we want to choose GPT. Easy to get caught out by this because if you choose MBR, you're limited to a certain size. So yeah, always choose GPT, do that, and then in a few moments we should have another disk appear. There we go. So that disk is now online. We've got a room for a volume. Let's make a new volume, and we'll call this Stark Apps. Hit next, finish. There we go. that is now provisioned. However, yeah, you go, F drive. So in here in a second, we should see, once it loads, our F drive. There we go. That disk we attached now appears, and it's our F drive. That's cool. Then if we go and check the machine spec and system properties, we should be able to see, boom, look at that. 2.8 gigahertz, 8 gig of RAM. And if we go to the task manager, we can see on CPU that we've got 2 sockets, or 2 virtual processors on 1 socket. That pretty much concludes us building a virtual machine, but I suppose we might want to show you how to delete it. Next step, we're going to sign out of that, see you in a bit. And we're going to stop the virtual machine and wait for this to finish. So that VM's now stopped, and you can see that it's been deallocated. Deallocated is in the state where it's not going to be costing you any money, so in theory we could leave that there. And I think there is a very small residual charge, things like the public IP address, but because that VM is stopped and deallocated, you're going to have absolutely minimal costs. And now we can actually just delete that VM. And here we can choose what we want to delete on the VM. So we can get rid of the OS disk, the data disk, the network interfaces, the public IP address. And to keep it tidy, we will delete all of them at once. But I suppose if you needed to keep the public IP for another project, you could do. And we'll go ahead and tick that and delete all those. So that's now deleting. Once that's done, that'll all be gone. That pretty much concludes our sort of like first major Azure video, but hopefully that's been super informative. I think one thing that we think is missing in a lot of videos is actually walk me through the wizard and tell me what you're clicking to do what, because it's super useful. So we wanted to put something together where we went through the sort of very basics, like build a virtual machine, but there's lots of questions like that. What do these settings do? What does that do? What is the best practice for this? And we hope that's been really useful, and hopefully this is the sort of the first of many videos on like how you can build resources in Azure, and we're planning to give you full step-by-step guides to pretty much anything you can think of. So if you have any ideas or any comments on like what you'd like to see, drop a comment in the comments box, and make sure you thumbs up this video, and don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned for our next one. Mic drop, out.